Many game modes from TF2 have come and gone, but one has survived through every major update and still holds a sizable audience. I'm of course talking about Vs Saxton Hale. But what makes VSH so special? Why have the community collectively clung to it, while countless other plugins were forgotten? And how did one community game mode from TF2's prehistoric era in 2010 survive all the way to the modern casual VScript period? To understand why, we need to go back and start from the game mode's very conception. Vs Saxton Hale was first created in the fall of 2009 by Lizard of Oz as a source mod plugin for TF2, but unlike other game modes from this time, Thunder Fortress, VSH's core gameplay experience stayed relatively unchanged. But where did the character of Saxton Hale come from? And why was he, of all people, the center point of an entire game mode? Saxton Hale as a character dates back to the Sniper vs Spy update from May 21st, 2009, and started off being a small joke, a punchline at the end of the update post, threatening the reader for one-on-one. This was also the first time Manco as a company in the TF2 universe was established. At first, Saxton Hale was meant to be just a gag, but the community's love for his over-the-top personality and Manco's wacky lore quickly made him a fan favorite. From here, the character of Saxton Hale was established as being a CEO, or in other words, a boss. This is what initially made the community separate Saxton from the rest of the mercs. I mean, first of all, a buff, shirtless Australian would never fit in with a bunch of American criminals. He is the leader of Manco. He carries around a sense of power and superiority with him, which is what made the community regard him as a final boss type character. Keep in mind, this was before Valve made any SFMs, or even included Saxton in the game. All the community had to go off were a few blog posts and unofficial comics. But the character of Saxton was established and beginning to get fleshed out. He was designed by Moby Frank, art style director for TF2, so it made sense why the community ate it up. By late 2009, community interest for this mystical CEO of Manco was rising, and eventually, fans started creating their own interpretations of Saxton Hale, leading to the creation of a fan update page for Saxton. A trend that was started by the community ever since the infamous Guard Dog update hoax. This eventually inspired the first plugin for Saxton Hale, building the entire game mode on the format of Arena, when it was actually being played in Valve servers, and a whole 31v1 juggernaut format. It worked, but it came with massive balancing repercussions. The way each game of Vs Saxton Hale works is one person is randomly chosen to be Hale, as the rest of the red team has to work together to eliminate Saxton, a reskinned buffed soldier with a melee-only attack and large health pool. In most servers, if the rest of the red team failed to defeat Saxton within a set period of time, or if the team player count dropped below a certain threshold, a control point would open, allowing any member on the red team to capture it and win. Mini crits on the primary to secondary weapons for last remaining teammates were given, with full crits being applied to the last player standing. You might be wondering how Saxton would stand any chance against red team with this much stacked against him. That's where we get to the abilities for Hale shared across multiple other bosses, such as Brave Jump, which charges up as the player crouches or ult fires, propelling them up into the air, Rage, which accumulates as the boss takes damage and once active allows the user to stun players nearby, similar to Ghost on Harvest, Way Down, which activates after being airborne for more than 5 seconds, allowing the boss to plummet to the ground, dealing AoE damage to nearby players. There's of course more minor abilities given to Hale to even the playing field, such as the Man Treads effect which lets Hale insta-kill players whose heads he lands on, and an escape plan effect being triggered, increasing movement speed as he takes damage. But these main abilities are the main factors which influence how a game of Vs Saxton Hale is played. Additionally, the health pool of the boss is dependent on the amount of players on red team, but at a minimum, it is 2046. In an effort to make the gameplay more fun and reduce waiting times for dead players, balancing for VSH was skewed disproportionately towards the red team, as a complete steamroll from blue's side resulted in unfun gameplay. However, you can already see some early cracks forming in the foundation for VSH and how it was developed. For example, the game mode type itself is literally based on Arena, and we all know the problems that made Valve abandon that game mode. You could die 10 seconds in and be stuck in the spectator cuck chair, watching a 2-minute Tom and Jerry chase unfold instead of actually playing the game. An important thing to note is during 2010 to 2011, a plugin which allowed respawns did exist, which had a shared pool of lives across the team, with each player having their own individual respawn cooldown, which increased every time another teammate died, along with the 2 cities reanimator feature for Medic on November 20th, 2013, being occasionally used in some VSH servers. But both of these solutions were a mere band-aid to the main problem of being forced to wait before you could play again. However, for the many design flaws VSH had, it also made some really great decisions to improve gameplay, most of which can be seen in Lizard of Oz's devlog. Most weapon rebalances are different depending on the server, so I'll just be going over the most popular weapon rebalance changes as recognized on the Team Fortress 2 wiki. Design choices like having the Spy's knife deal from 10% to 60% of the Hale's health, depending on the red team player count, made the Spy even more of a glass cannon class compared to the base game, making his playstyle more satisfying and fun. Furthermore, the implementation of crits for melee and the conversion of mini crits to critical hits for most weapons, such as the critical of a scout alongside the direct hit, was a really smart move for the most part, as it made crits easier to get while buffing already underpowered weapons in the context of VS Saxton Hale, further helping to tip the scales in the favor of the mercenaries. The entire game mode was oriented towards fast-paced action gameplay, and this is seen in how turtling or annoying playstyles were heavily discouraged, both subtly by nerfing weapons such as Spy's Cloak in the presence of dispensers, and reducing metal pickup from ammo crates to the small version, or more obviously by outright banning weapons like the Cloak and Dagger or Natasha, alongside giving bosses like Hale the ability to super jump, and in some servers, Goomba stomp players who stayed still in one spot for too long, like scoped in snipers. When you introduce a Juggernaut class against a team of comparatively weak classes, every match would become a steamroll for the Hale side. So how did Lizard of Oz fix this issue? The first answer comes down to weapons. Most of the weapons designed for normal games of TF2 are pretty well balanced. Keyword, normal games. A gun which would normally take out an enemy in 2 to 3 shots up close does nothing when your enemy has a health pool in the thousands. And oh yeah, melee. Melee was already bad enough as is, but the risk now when pulling it out and getting up close and personal to an opponent who can one-tap you is disproportionate compared to reward. Lizard of Oz knew all of this, which is why many weapon changes and even class changes were implemented to level the playing field. There are countless weapon changes and class rebalances that have come and gone during the development of VSH, but I'll go over the most prominent ones which were implemented as early as 2009 and stuck throughout the core gameplay all the way up to VScript. Pyro could soar through the skies as the detonator received a huge buff, allowing for Pyro to effectively rocket jump across the map, at the cost of dealing way more self-inflicted damage as opposed to the rocket launcher or sticky bomb launcher. This change allowed for the Pyro to at least have some options for mobility, alongside making for some really epic sketch check extinguisher moments. But let's be real, the risk you face getting up close and personal with the boss who can one-tap you just to do a bit of extra damage doesn't make it worth it. This balance change makes Pyro somewhat usable in VSH, as he has one great mobility option, but overall, at least in this era of VSH, Pyro is still not good. Although the super detonator change wasn't directly implemented into modern versions of the game mode, it did heavily influence how Pyro's balancing was handled in later iterations. In modern VScript Vs Saxton Hale, instead of this modern change being directly applied to Pyro, he gained more of a supportive role through his air blast and combo abilities through the extinguisher. Another drastic gameplay change is wall climbing, but only for sniper. Yeah, we'll get to the VScript version of Vs Saxton Hale later on in the video, but wall climbing effectively functioned the exact same as in later iterations, but with the added side effect of 15 damage taken every time you climbed. Something which can easily be negated by the cozy camper, or by the fact that you're probably never going to take damage from hail or anything else. This gameplay change made Sniper much more versatile in his ability to find better perch spots, giving him more verticality and improving his ability to, snipe. Demo Knight went from being a meme gimmick subclass to a serious threat in this game mode, as he saw some prominent changes that carried over into later versions of the game. One of the best examples being his charging and shield mechanics, which were buffed to make him an actual threat to Hale. Demo Knight, with his already high health pool, could tank a hit, but combine that with a shield that lets him absorb a hit with a sword like the half Zatoichi, and he can effectively slice through Saxton's health pool, punishing the boss for missing shots. This made Demo Knight go from meme subclass to server menace, promoting a more aggressive and chaser playstyle for gameplay. Finally, the engineer was given changes that nudged his playstyle more into offense rather than turtling. Many changes such as reducing metal pickup of engineers and having abilities such as Way Down or Rage nullify most turtle playstyles before they even have a chance to start. Instead, the engineer in VSH usually always is given an amplifier as part of the amplifier plugin, a building which can't be upgraded and replaces your dispenser costing 100 metal. The amplifier allows for teammates standing nearby to receive critical hits and encourages teammates to group together, as a scattered team makes it way easier for the boss to pick off teammates and win each time. Overall, through adding the amplifier and heavily punishing the turtling playstyle, Engineer's gameplay is more supportive and offensive in VSH. In modern VScript VSH, this change translated directly through instead buffing Saxton's ability to deal with turtling engineers, with things like his charge, way down, and Saxton punch, without outright nerfing NG directly. Public perception for VSH at this time, in 2010 to 2011, was great. No other community game mode felt as riveting or innovative as VSH, and something about the gameplay loop itself was so inherently satisfying for the player. Maybe it was a challenge and reward that came with taking out Saxton as a team. Maybe it was the catharsis people got from unleashing all their anger on a human pincushion. Or maybe it was a mix of all of these. Nonetheless, Vs Saxton Hale earned its place in the hearts of many community servers and the broader TF2 community. Now, it was more about refining and updating the game mode over time for the TF2 player base. But as the years went on, the modern game began to change, and VSH needed to evolve with it. Following 2011 to 2012, Vs Saxton Hale would continue development, even after Lizard of Oz stepped away from maintaining the original plugin. At this point, Flaming Sarge was able to swoop in and take over the game mode. Development was slowing, and the game mode was entering a critical phase, where normally, you'd expect this game mode to collapse, but quite the opposite happened. After being trusted by Lizard of Oz, Flaming Sarge became the first to maintain the plugin, bridging the gap between the original design and retroactively fixing a lot of Lizard of Oz's questionable choices, as stated in his devlog. However, it wasn't going to be easy for Flaming Sarge, as he had to navigate messy legacy code, buggy mechanics, and somehow meet the expectations of an entire community anticipating balance changes and fresh updates, all while preserving what Lizard of Oz made to make Vs Saxton Hale special. Times were changing in the TF2 community, with new updates, an influx of brand new players from the free-to-play update, and new servers popping up left, right, and center. This was arguably the toughest period for VSH to make it through, and the amount of pressure Flaming Sarge would have experienced at this time would have made anyone crack. Players were expecting nuanced balance, responsive mechanics, and fresh new additions to the game mode. Every new weapon Valve added forced Flaming Sarge to go back to the drawing board to fix VSH's balance. One prominent example were unlocks, which worked fine in normal gameplay, but would have been broken or borderline useless in VSH's Juggernaut format. Flaming Sarge no longer was someone maintaining the codebase of VSH and allied modders. He became a game designer who had to rework game mechanics and balance the game in the context of a 31v1 server format. Flaming Sarge didn't inherit a neatly optimized put-together project. It was a Frankenstein mismatch of early 2010 source mod scripting expected from an amateur developer who hadn't had enough experience under his belt for a project of this magnitude. According to Sarge himself, Lizard of Oz had a really interesting habit of naming code variables very arbitrary things, and it was really messy to try and read through the code. For anyone remotely familiar with programming, you know how annoying it is to try decipher unlabeled, unorganized code. Flaming Sarge was forced to trudge through the kind of codebase which was messy, unoptimized, and stitched together by passion. Keep in mind, this was in 2011, before GitHub became the gold standard for source mod collaboration, before version control was standard, and before modders even had clean workflows. Flaming Sarge explained that neither he nor Lizard of Oz used version control at the time, so collaboration at this point was sending messages and updates to each other back and forth through the forums, and diff checking them in a text editor. In his own words, it was a very haphazard collaboration when it did happen. You can imagine what it was like trying to maintain a live game mode with thousands of players and multiple servers relying on you when this is the state of your workflow. But knowing what he was getting himself into, after playing the game mode and thinking, this could use improving, he still jumped in headfirst trying to fix VSH. The culmination of all Flaming Sarge's efforts would be version 1.36, the single most important update in early VSH history, bringing in so many additions players now take for granted. He had full creative control in the 1.36 update, and did nearly everything for it, adding CVARs and commands to give server operators more control, music toggles, detonator jumps, and even more unique interactions for Spy's knives. This is where he also added the Demoman head gain mechanics, finally giving the Islander some use in the game mode. Furthermore, he fixed Hale's invisible shovel problem, finally giving Saxton fists 2 years in development. Shocking, I know. This wasn't just happening in a vacuum. The TF2 landscape was evolving fast. The game entered its golden era in terms of weapon updates, and each new unlock threatened to interfere with VSH in some way. As Flaming Sarge stated, anytime Valve added new weapons, I usually added some specific behavior for it, meaning he was constantly troubleshooting problems which arose from new weapon additions, such as missing gameplay mechanics. Items like the Wanga Prick needed to behave like the Eternal Reward. The Babyface Blaster needed a full rework, so its boost bar drained like the Soda Popper. The Bushwhacker gained wall climbing, inspired by the Kopesh Climber from Advanced Weaponizer. Even the crossbow had to be nerfed already, because Valve buffed it on top of the buffs VSH already had. This is where Flaming Sarge had to go full live service game designer mode during one of the most active years for Team Fortress 2. Behind all of this was Flaming Sarge's secret motivation, Randomizer. He admitted his biggest push to overhaul weapon interactions came from wanting VSH to function inside randomizer servers. In his own words, I wanted to make sure everything they could roll would either get auto-replaced with the appropriate weapon, or actually had some function. The philosophy that every unlock should matter is why Flaming Sarge shaped VSH into the most robust and replayable source mode experience of the era. Meanwhile, the allied modders forums for VSH were popping off. This was a time where threads were filled with server owners reporting bugs, players requesting features, and separate forks online. You had people modifying the game mode for Toyo Hale, and the inclusion of all sorts of custom bosses. People like Wildcard65 contributing fixes, and Shidata experimenting with his own versions, which we'll get back to later. The community at this point weren't just mindlessly consuming VSH. Instead, they were contributing to it and creating content for it. Flaming Sarge was right in the middle of that storm, trying to keep the official version of the plugin stable, while communities surrounding it exploded with creativity. This is where the pressure started to kick in. Flaming Sarge was maintaining VSH during college, a period where VSH was amongst more arguably pressuring things at the time. Yet he still found time to push updates, respond to community feedback, and keep the game mode alive. This was before TF2 modding had Discord servers, or even GitHub repos. Everything occurred through allied modders. If someone found the bug, they'd post it on the forums, and hope Flaming Sarge or any other VSH maintainer would see it. Despite pressures from college life, and all the more reasons to stop working on VSH, Flaming Sarge pushed forward. He kept delivering new content, fixing bugs, and balancing new weapons added in TF2's updates. This was all until his final major contribution, version 1.42 of the plugin. Notably, adding the Easter Bunny boss, using a model by Deity Link on Game Banana. It was a bizarre, memorable addition to the plugin, perfectly slotting in amongst the other wacky Hale roster. However, as he pushed forward with VSH, the dynamic between him and Lizard of Oz was shifting. After update 1.36, Flaming Sarge was still working on both maintenance and balance updates alongside Lizard of Oz. who slowly lessened work on the project in favor of focusing on Freak Fortress 2. It was at this point he became the solo developer of the plugin, and by March 2013, his time maintaining VSH Saxton Hale came to a close. He stepped away after 1.42, focusing on more pressing matters and other projects, closing the chapter on one of the most important eras in VSH's history. He not only carried the plugin throughout the early 2010s, but laid the foundation for a future developer to step in exactly where he left off. This is where the story takes a turn, because when Flaming Sarge left, the game mode didn't die with him. Instead, someone else carried the flame. Someone who had already been lurking in the community for a while, contributing fixes, experimenting with forks, and building a reputation of pushing the boundaries for what VSH could be. Someone who would be qualified enough to take the mod into a different direction, expand upon it, and carry it into the modern era. Flaming Sarge was able to maintain and preserve VSH Saxton Hale, continuing from where Lizard of Oz left off in the early 2010s, but he eventually had to step down and hand the plugin off to one last developer, who would go on to make some of the most impactful contributions to the game mode. So who was this developer? His name was Chidata, and like everyone else, his introduction to VSH was very straightforward. Chidata was introduced to VSH early on, after trying it out from his little brother, basically falling in love with the game mode in the early 2010s. He practically lived on the same community server 24/7. Eventually, he became a moderator, but he wouldn't just settle for being a moderator for a VSH server. No, he set his sights much higher, using his game dev insights to identify small changes to weapons and core mechanics that could meaningfully improve the experience. He went on to request changes to the VSH server owner, but without the knowledge of how to implement them, those suggestions risked falling into obscurity. Instead, Chidata was motivated to take matters into his own hands, learning how to modify a source mod plugin, and eventually making Mantreads deal 1024 damage per stomp to Saxton Hale. The way Chidata would go about updating VSH Saxton Hale was through small targeted improvements, which would be felt by players worldwide. Small updates to the public plugin, like balance changes and weapon changes to improve usability and enjoyment. This decision to not change the plugin too much reflected Chidata's design philosophy approach of tackling parts of the plugin players didn't think were necessary, but were greatly appreciated. This development approach will not only maintain the identity of the game mode, but keep most of what Lizard of Oz gave the developers, as after all, the plugin started off in a pretty good state, and just from Lizard of Oz's additions, probably would have continued to hold up without Flaming Sarge or Chidata ever laying a finger on it. So small targeted changes and regular maintenance as TF2 updated only made sense. He would continue regularly maintaining the plugin throughout the mid-2010s, but that would slow down as life would get in the way, and he would start his own private version of VSH for his server, TF2 Data. TF2 Data essentially became his playground to make whatever kind of crazy change he wanted, without being restricted by the original VSH plugin to an active player base. This is where a lot of balance changes were trialed, eventually making their way into VSH Saxton Hale mode after being beta tested there first. Chidata would continue to preserve the legacy of the VSH game mode, frequenting the Allied Modders forums to post updates and respond to player feedback regarding new additions to the plugin, in either his personal server or the forums as a whole. As one of the final active maintainers of the original VSH source mode plugin, Chidata definitely left a positive impact on the game mode, as he contributed great changes and bug fixes for the plugin, which is all reflected in the Allied Modders forum post. But how is the community feeling at this point about VSH post 2014, during arguably one of the golden eras for the game, with the influx of players, frequent updates, and niche YouTube presence? The general landscape for the VSH community was mostly servers which ran the base vanilla plugin, Freak Fortress 2 servers, Turbo servers, and Chidata's TF2 Data server. Just like the owner for the server Chidata would frequent on, most server owners didn't know how to code or compile the plugin. This meant server owners were limited by the amount of things they could add to the game mode experience, aside from third-party plugins online. From this reason, you could say for most server owners who weren't actively changing the plugin, the game mode plateaued, as normal servers just couldn't add any new content. With many servers playing the exact same way, players started to get tired of playing. This stagnation in new content for the game mode would contribute to the slow decline for VSH servers for years to come. and would leave only the most diehard fans of the plugin populating the servers. Unlike other game modes at the time, VSH wasn't able to strike YouTube audiences the same way and go viral, leading to most of the traffic for the game mode coming from people curious enough to join a VSH server from the server browser or word of mouth. Overall, this is what led to VSH having a small but loyal audience, much like any other game mode which populated the servers. Furthermore, a main VSH Steam group founded in 2010 existed, acting as a hub for players to suggest weapon and game balance changes to the game mode, find servers, and just hang out. By the late 2010s, after the infamous Meet Your Match update, many community servers saw a nosedive in players, as Quick Play, one of the main player streams for community servers, was removed. This especially impacted VSH, as there were just tons of empty VSH servers, and only 2 main modded communities stayed regularly populated. VSH Saxton Hale, which had custom edits and balance changes, and Chidata's TF2 data server. VSH was still run by many popular chains such as Skyle or Panda Community, however. It was evident that players were seeking forms of VSH that shook up the formula in some way, or just had new content, and this demand will be met by separate branches of the VSH community. Remember, VSH was open source, meaning anyone could download the code and upload their own forks of the game mode on allied modders, which is what people did, and these alternative versions would reach notoriety in their own way in the TF2 community. Except for one thing that I forgot to mention. The early 2010s were a sort of renaissance period for the TF2 custom game mode community, at arguably the golden age of TF2, with an influx of players coming in from the free-to-play nature of the game and updates, alongside more developers willing to experiment and try new spins on already tried and tested game modes. During this era, we got many game modes, like Times 1000 and Slender Fortress, but more notably, Freak Fortress 2, a plugin derived from the original VSH game mode, also created by Lizard of Oz in 2012. If VSH kept adding new bosses with every update, the original cast would eventually lose their charm. Part of what made Vs Saxton Hale so memorable was that it had a tight-knit roster, but people kept wanting more variety, more characters, more gimmicks, and eventually Lizard of Oz went, "Fine, have all the bosses you want," creating Freak Fortress 2, the Wild West of VSH alternatives. I don't need to re-explain how the gameplay mechanics work, because at its core, this plugin is just VSH, but with every pop culture reference known to mankind added. So instead, I'll just be going over what works and what doesn't. When I first played Freak Fortress 2, I was pleasantly surprised by how diverse the boss lineup was. It wasn't just popular video game icons, there was also obscure references to old TF2 Gmod videos, old memes, and community inside jokes. Many of these bosses introduced much needed fresh mechanics and abilities, which didn't feel repetitive or one note. Arguably, that variety is the best part of Freak Fortress. Every round encouraged different strategies against highly mobile bosses, or overpowered rage abilities, shaking up the formula in a way base VSH needed. Compared to the original source mod VSH plugin, you don't get as comfortable or familiar with each boss. Freak Fortress shines when the match is close, and when your team isn't cruising past every round. That tension is rare in Vs Saxton Hale, especially since everyone who plays the game mode already knows the weaknesses of the original 4 bosses inside and out. Now we get to the negatives, and oh boy, this game mode certainly has some highs and lows. With how many new bosses, or should I say, freaks, have been added over the years, the overall quality has been really inconsistent. You'd either get a pretty well-balanced boss, most likely from the plugin's launch, with a well-rounded ability set, or the most brain-dead overpowered round-stalling boss, which makes you wonder why you even gave this game mode a shot. This can be explained by the devs simply not being able to give each boss the same level of polish that the original VSH cast had, especially since a lot of the bosses were made by amateur source modders using the boss template. If you play this game mode, you should expect at least every freak to be either a hit or miss. But if you can overlook the inconsistent gameplay quality, Freak Fortress 2 has a lot to offer in its novel experience each round. A lot of popular servers even include the base VSH cast in the roster, so you can pretty much treat this plugin as VSH with extra steps. However, if you want to step back from all that hit or miss popular game reference boss nonsense, and don't want to deal with whatever glitches might be present in an over-decade-old source mod, then I've got the perfect VSH fork for you. The original VSH source mod plugin, unexpectedly, was being held up with duct tape and bubblegum, which is why a team of other developers decided to recreate the plugin with cleaner optimized code and brought their own rendition of the game mode while staying as faithful to the source material as possible. Think of VSH Rewritten as upgrading the engine to your old 1990 car model. Everything still works the same above the hood, but it runs noticeably smoother. That's how I describe VSH Rewritten, smoother. And instead of me telling you all about it, I managed to get in contact with 2 developers of the plugin to provide more insight to why it was created and the problems it aimed to solve present in the original Lizard of Oz version. Before VSH Rewritten even existed, the Red Sun community was already experimenting with their own take on the game mode. Back in 2016, Red Sun switched from the hidden to Chidata's version of Vs Saxton Hale, and over time, they heavily modified it to fit their own design philosophy. But the deeper they went, the more the codebase turned into a nightmare, duct taped together, and completely unsuited for the addition of new content. Eventually, the plugin became so bloated that even small changes risked breaking everything. That's where Kenzzer comes in. As a developer for Red Sun, he wanted to completely rebuild VSH from the ground up, with cleaner, modern code. His version, unoriginally titled VSH Rewritten, pulled inspiration from places like Aussie Furrow City and aimed to fix years of technical debt while staying faithful to the original design. Development moved slowly for almost a year, and by late 2018, it finally went live on Red Sun. But the reception was mixed. Some of the new balance decisions didn't land well with the community, and after months of complaints, Kenzzer stepped away from the project entirely. But that wasn't the end for Rewrite. 42, who was a newer programmer at the time, didn't want to see the project go to waste. He took over development, continuing to refine and expand Rewrite for Red Sun. Meanwhile, Kenzzer moved to the DFS community and created an entirely separate fork of VSH Rewritten, tailored to their server. For a while, both Red Sun and DFS had competing versions of the Rewrite, 2 different creative visions of what a fixed version of VSH should have been. DFS eventually stopped updating their fork, while 42's version continued receiving updates for years, until development finally slowed down in 2023. Today, VSH Rewritten is still used, but it's gone to a kind of zombie state. Stable, functional, but no longer being updated. What made it unique though, was its philosophy. Red Sun's version always aimed for more serious, TF2 themed balancing. No chaotic gimmicks, no BS bosses, and especially no pop culture reference characters. Every boss had to fit the TF2 universe and bring something mechanically distinct without going too crazy. It was a grounded, disciplined take on VSH. The polar opposite of the Wild West, anything goes approach you see in Freak Fortress 2. Why was Vs Saxton Hale Rewrite created in the first place? Like, what did it aim to fix from the original plugin?
I was a developer for a TF2 community called Red Sun. Thing is, they like to have modifications for their servers. Vs Saxton Hale wasn't programmed in a good way, with quotes. I talked to the others and I told them, I'm going to rewrite the entire plugin because right now I can't add anything without spending more time than if I was rewriting all of it. That's how it started at the beginning.
Going back to the car analogies I used for VSH Rewritten, and how that version feels like a smoother experience, you can imagine VSH VScript as taking an old car engine, throwing the entire thing out the window, crushing the 1990 sedan in a junkyard compactor, and buying a brand new Lamborghini. Because that's exactly what VSH VScript is. The release of VScript VSH was met with overwhelming praise. Leading up to TF2's first new summer update, fans were already hyped for this established game mode finally getting an official version, especially since a small patch 6 months earlier added VScript support directly into the game. The launch came with 4 aesthetically pleasing maps, which closely followed the game's art style, and Saxton Hale finally getting his own view models after 15 years. If that alone wasn't enough to get excited about, I don't know what is. But there was a small vocal minority of people from the original Vs Saxton Hale source mode community who despised this new official take. And their frustration came mostly from how dramatically it diverged from the design choices that made the original plugin so charming. Apart from the obvious buff Australian-shaped elephant in the room, nearly nothing besides the essence of VSH carried over into the VScript port, making the two versions essentially different game modes. The removal or simplification of many class changes in VScript was a deliberate choice. Lizard of Oz wanted to streamline the gameplay of the plugin, so that even someone named Pablo Gonzalez 2003 could hop into a match with VSH Saxton Hale without wanting to immediately punch his monitor. Removing rage, stripping down class movement mechanics, and giving everyone the same basic wall climber sniper, minus the damage, made the game much more digestible and beginner friendly, but it also removed a lot of the nuance and depth that veterans loved about the original. All of these massive changes explain why VScript VSH is so divisive. People tend to fall firmly on one side or the other.
It's a new take on the same game mode with new animations and maps, and modernizes it to a more current version of the game's art style, but it's unbalanced and broken. It's just not ready.
When summer rolled around and VSH was added, it had a pretty rough launch. Some issues weren't Lizard of Oz's fault, but other problems took months to retroactively fix, as a result of the rushed 6-month development cycle and the lack of proper beta testing. If you know what I mean when I say the words Bunny Hale, you know exactly what it was like being in the trenches during the Summer vs Saxton Hale launch. Later on, VScript VSH eventually got some much needed improvements. Most notably, the cooldown on Brave Jump, finally stopping Hale from transforming into a big bunny hopping across the entire map. A few other balancing tweaks helped too, but man, all of this felt too little too late. If this game mode had 1 or 2 extra months in the oven, I genuinely think the reception on launch would have been drastically better. After the summer 2023 hype passed, VScript VSH was now officially in the maintenance phase of any game mode, receiving minor balancing changes or bug patches, as Lizard of Oz moved on to different projects. But just when everyone thought VSH was finished, on April 18th, 2024, Lizard of Oz and his team came out the gate with a brand new VSH map without Saxton. Actually, that still is Saxton, but as a robot. You know what I mean. Disregarding the fact this map had a fully animated SFM with the official TF2 voice actors in it. Yeah, you heard me. Official voice actors voicing the mercenaries in the short trailer. This new map set the precedent of making VSH maps in completely different environments and with completely new bosses, which leads us into 2025, where we've now completely left the gravel pits and badlands that we're used to, arriving in a Dracula-themed castle with a vampire boss.
I did also get to writing a few more bosses. One that's actually out now, Countess. She actually had different abilities during development until we had to change that because they were kind of bad. And so it's a little more better now. I feel like I can say it for a little bit of everyone that we don't need another character like Hale again. It wouldn't hurt to have original characters in that regard anyways.
Does the legacy plugin have any gameplay elements you miss? Or does VScript just wipe the floor with the old plugin?
Can't say I miss anything from the plugin. Nah. VScript wipes the floor on it, but because like from all the things that came from VScript outweigh everything that came from the plugin.
VSH Saxton Hale is one of the lucky few game modes which didn't need to reinvent itself to survive. You're still going to get largely the same experience you would have had 5 or even 10 years ago if you join any server. Whether or not that's a good thing, I'll let you decide for yourself. What we can undeniably agree on is that VSH is one of the most grounded game modes in TF2's universe. Even Valve seemed to agree, adding it to casual in the summer 2023 update. Yet despite that, the game mode remains relatively niche within the wider scope of TF2's community. It's become more of an I like to watch it, but don't play it game mode. A level of attention most community plugins never get. VSH Saxton Hale has certainly gone through a wild journey, from all the remakes and custom plugins to its eventual VScript implementation in casual. Despite TF2's updates, changing player base, and the catastrophe of Meet Your Match, this game mode never went out of style. A testament both to Lizard of Oz's game design and the loyalty of the player base. Just remember, VSH Saxton Hale could have had it much worse. I'm honestly surprised changes like Quick Play's removal didn't completely nuke an already niche audience the same way it did for many community servers. So instead of dwelling on all the VSH communities which died, we should celebrate the small but dedicated player base that's left, keeping this game mode alive after all these years. Vs Saxton Hale earned its place in the Hall of Fame across other timeless TF2 game modes, and will continue to do so for as long as Team Fortress 2 is alive. Very few community game modes even make it past a single year, let alone over a decade, and yet VSH persists through the loyalty of its playbase, its replayability, and design. If I had to describe Vs Saxton Hale in one word, it would be replayability. Despite playing hours and hours of this game mode for this video, I just never got burnt out, and much like a tradie at the local pokies, I kept coming back for more. Each round after I died, I'd patiently wait for another spin at the wheel, trying out a new gameplay strategy, class, or loadout. Something which I felt across all forms of this game mode, including VScript. And something I'm sure many others can relate to. No other game mode makes you think and strategize while you spectate as much as VSH. Getting gameplay footage of VSH was harder than I initially expected. So many servers were empty, and as TF2 bleeds players each year, it's only going to get worse. Still, there were a handful of active servers I could rely on, kept alive by the small communities that won't let this game mode fade into obscurity. There's not a whole lot we can do about declining player counts or dying servers, beyond showing up and supporting the ones that remain. But if you want to help Vs Saxton Hale beat the odds, there is one thing you, the viewer, can do. Subscribe. I know, another YouTuber begging for subscriptions, but just by supporting videos like the one you just watched, which don't get made often, you let more people see this video, subsequently boosting VSH's player counts. Personally, I think the choice is obvious. If you made it this far, you'll probably also enjoy another deep dive on another game mode. Click the video on screen if you want to get spooked by Slender Fortress, and as always, have a good one.